Hello guys, my name is Muhammad Alan Adibudaus with serial number 176. Okay, I will tell you about the review set from the article with the title Western Theory and Historical Study of Chinese Literary Criticism with the author Zhirongzhu. The background is a professor at East China Normal University. His major research field cover ancient Chinese literary theory and German classical aesthetic. The name of the journal is Comparative Literature and Culture. The date is 2020, page 1 until 9 and volume 22. Use issue 5 and that is a URL. The keyword is historical study, Chinese literary, Western theory, ideas, literature, and literary criticism. In the first, I will tell you about the abstract title and references. The purpose of this paper is to examine the formation of modern historical status of classical Chinese literary criticism in terms of its interaction with and transformation of Western theory. This discipline emerged during the eastward movement of Western idea in the early 20th century, promoting the scientific study of classical Chinese learning and institutionalizing curricula and textbooks in Chinese university. The acceptance of Western concept of literature and literary criticism in the early 20th century, largely through Japan, laid the very foundation of the historical study of classical Chinese literary criticism as a subject of independent study. This paper argues that when adopting Western method and cross-referencing Chinese and Western learning, the specificity of classical Chinese literary criticism should be a central issue of inquiry. In addition, the author also described the method they use in their study in the abstract section. The author examines the modern history of classical Chinese literary criticism was founded as a subject of study in the context of the movement of ideas from the West to the East, so as part of the socio-ideological trend of using scientific method to organize national heritage and the need to modernize culture. At first, Western ideas were first introduced by the missionaries. Later returning overseas Chinese students, having studied in Europe, the United States, Japan, and other places abroad, also helped to popularize Western ideas. In 1907, Ronghong or Winyu published in English his autobiography, My Life in China and America. It was translated in 1915 into Chinese under the title China West to East. Since the movement of ideas from the West to the East has become popular in China, the use of Western ideas to study classical Chinese literature can be traced back to the late Qing Dynasty and the early Republic of China, and this also led to changes in the conception of literature in China. Later, these evolutionary ideas further influenced the study of the history of classical Chinese literature. For example, a new approach to the study of Chinese literature depicts the historical development of classical Chinese literature through this new evolutionary lens. The author used a qualitative method by studying literature through the theoretical framework of speech act theory from of Chinese literary criticism. Kuo divided the history of Chinese literary criticism into three stages. Number one is evolution of literary concepts, and the second restoration of literary concept, and the last one is complaining of literary criticism. The naming of the three stages reflect the influence of the theory of evolution on the historical study of classical Chinese literary criticism. The author collects data from Chinese literary historical, which is then analyzed through discourse analyzed with a pragmatic approach. The findings of this study are also disclosed by the author at the end of the abstract. The author explained that this study shows that when adopting Western method and cross-referencing Chinese and Western learning, the specificity of classical Chinese literary criticism should be a central issue of inquiry. So overall, the author described the objective, method, and finding of the well-conducted study in the abstract. So the reader can know the initial picture when reading the article. Apart from that, the author used titles that are informative and relevant to the overall content of the article. Judging from the title, the reader can see that in this article we can learn theory from various writers regarding Chinese and Western learning. Of course, this is very informative for a reader to find out what the strategy they use are. Not only the title is relevant, but the author also used relevant references that are properly referenced. Author used references from various new studies and long related to the study of the modern history of classical Chinese literary criticism on Chinese and Western learning. So the references referred to by the author are in accordance with the research. The keyword that the author include the abstract also respond to the main focus of the study. For introduction and background, the author explained clearly the topic used in the introduction. The background of the research is described in detail in this section. The author also adds a literature review in the introduction section and also in the method section and various other related studies to make it easier for readers to understand the topic discussed. For the methodology, as mentioned in the abstract, the author used a qualitative literature review method and then analyzed the data using a pragmatic approach. The author described this section into several separate subsections for the convenience of the reader. For example, in this method section, the author provides clear explanation in several separate subsections related to the article created by the author. The author used this new system method clearly referring to Western scientific method and theories to interpret Chinese literary ideas and sources. Guo Xiaoyu, in turn, used a systematic method to compare and cross-reference Chinese literary criticism with Western literary criticism. He used Western epistemology and the notion of institution to discuss Zhuangzi's Tao's aesthetic ideas. Lu Kenzi's history of Chinese literary criticism combined Chinese and Western ways of classification. The creation of theory and appreciation theory are of Western origin, while the name tone and melody theory and style and genre categories are of Chinese origin. Author described it very well, starting from various institutions in China. Also, the data analysis section is also explained in detail by the author, where there is qualitative analysis, framework of analysis, and qualitative analysis. So overall, I think the method used is sufficient, described, valid, reliable, and relevant. In the finding and result section, the author provides an explanation regarding the finding quite clearly and in detail. The data is presented appropriately in the form of literature with clear information in accordance with the title of the article. The author also revealed that the scientific method used referred to the Western academic method in modern China, called the Western method the scientific method. At the time, Chinese scholars generally advocate studying the history of Chinese literary criticism using the scientific method of Western literary criticism theory, as an attempt by early Chinese intellectuals to adapt to world literary trends. The construction of the study of classical Chinese literary criticism as a subject of study embodies several historical values that need to be interpreted dialectically. Having started more than 90 years ago, the predecessor of Chinese literary criticism learned from Western academic method and studied the history of classical Chinese literary criticism, cross-referencing Chinese and Western scholarship. To a certain extent, the pioneers of Chinese studies were conquered with acceptance and application of Western literary theory, which was indeed an important endeavor, not only in providing the necessary supplement to traditional Chinese academic method, but also in laying the theoretical foundation for the determination of the subject as a topic of study. Therefore, Chinese scholarship in this research should also pay attention the method and theories of traditional Chinese criticism, such as literary style theory and textual research. However, the negative value of this article in the absence of a tabel, it can make the reader a little confused, but if the reader is able to understand and focus on from the beginning to the end. Readers will have no difficulty in understanding with article. However, I think the author need to add the table so that the reader can know the result and avoid misunderstanding the reader in understanding the data in the table presented. The author also give a lot example of language selection and speech use to make it easier to understand by readers. In my opinion, the result of this discovery cannot be easily understood by ordinary people even though several tables and figures has been given. This is because the reader must really understand the theory used in analyzing the data. Discussion and conclusion. The conclusion of this article is sufficient to answer the purpose of this paper, which is to examine the formation of the modern historical of classical Chinese literary criticism in terms of its interaction with and transformation of Western theory. So it is obtained that the comparison between Chinese and Western literature is first removed from the table of content and then removed from the book. The reason from this is that the comparison between Chinese and Western literature will inevitably seem ineffective and trace of rigid imitation. Nevertheless, the influence of Western literary criticism on Swiss book is evident. In the process of using Western academic sources, one must compare them with Chinese origin theories and sources to building a scientific historical study of classical Chinese literature. Kuo Shaoyu praised Liu Jiaying's collection of classical Chinese poetry in his written talk on the study of theoretical criticism of classical Chinese literature at the 1980 Classical Chinese Literature Research Symposium for the Natural Integration of Chinese and Western Literary Theory, and that is, on the other hand, we must learn from the Western scientific method to establish the subject of the study of the classical Chinese literary criticism and modernize the study. On the other hand, we must pay attention to Chinese literary criticism, which is different from Western literary criticism and has its own values. The comparative study of literary criticism method between China and the West will encourage the development of history studies of literary criticism between China and the West. Traditional Chinese literature and literary criticism that are incompatible with Western science still have specific concept and judgment. Western literary ideas and criticism should be used as a reference rather than as a criterion from judging and merit and the merit of the study of the history of classical Chinese literature. That's all my presentation. Thank you.